Greatest heavyweight in MMA history may be on the line tonight as Daniel Cormier and Stipe Miocic go head-to-head for the third time to end the trilogy. And joining us now on the Boardwalk Kind of Hotline to talk more about it, he is John Morgan, lead reporter for MMA Junkie, USA Today. Talk more about that and all that with UFC 252. John, how you doing on this Saturday?
I'm good, man. Just hanging out in quarantine and waiting to get the results of my COVID test back and then get to these fights tonight, man. That's the way of the world these days, right?
Absolutely. By the way, before we get to that, I don't know if you saw the news, but they made the approval for the new Saliva Direct test. So it looks like a lot of those nose tests might be going away soon because the new saliva test has a 90% accuracy rate, and you don't have to wait as long for it.
Hey, man, I'm all for that. Those tests are the absolute worst, man. Anything you can do to get rid of those, I'm okay with.
So let's talk about these fights today. We got to start with Stipe versus DC. The first question I want to ask you is, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I want to get your perspective on it because you've covered the MMA game for a long time. How legitimate is this idea that coming out of this fight tonight could be the guy with the title of greatest heavyweight in MMA history?
You know, it's a great promotional line, but I think it's one that could be arguable. I mean, of course, Dana White, UFC president, he's promoting his brand, so he says, nope, no argument, this is it. I don't know. I mean, Fedor Emelianenko is a name that, newer MMA fans might not know, but people who have been around the game for a long time will understand the run that he had over in Pride, which was in Japan. And at the time, Pride was the world's leading MMA organization, especially in the heavyweight division. They had some of the greatest of all time. Now, they did allow kind of freak show matchups, and you could point to some of his, some of the fights that he had. It's not necessarily facing, the number 2 guy in the world at all times. But I think for him, for long-time MMA fans, I think that would probably be the guy that you'd have at top. But in terms of UFC history, now it's a little bit more arguable there. I mean, Stipe Miocic already has, more title defenses in heavyweight history in the UFC than anybody else. So for him to add to that and to win, this trilogy battle, I think he would certainly have a claim. With Cormier, it's also a little interesting because a lot of Cormier's history took place at light heavyweight. So he's kind of had his career across 2 divisions. Do you count the successes he had there when you're evaluating whether or not, he was the greatest heavyweight of all time? I don't know. I think you kind of stick to what's done in the division. So, it's definitely a discussion point. It's not like it's completely out of left field, but it's not as cut and dry as that would make it sound.
Yeah, and bring up the fact that Cormier, he has that split experience and the fact that he got into the game so much later. You have to wonder that if for Cormier, win or lose tonight, to me, his legacy is more about the success he had in both divisions than one division, whereas Miocic, like Fedor to an extent, his whole reign, his whole success has been in basically one weight class, where guys like Daniel Cormier and a guy previously like Randy Couture, they were moving up and down in weight class, and that's more a part of their resume to me.
Yeah, I agree. That's what makes it kind of a difficult decision to make because, you don't want to, completely wipe away what Cormier did at light heavyweight. But, is Cormier one of the greatest fighters of all time? Yeah, absolutely. You look at what he accomplished, his record. Of course, the losses to Jon Jones are the things that stand out, but Jon Jones also perhaps the greatest of all time, So, basically Cormier's undefeated other than losing to the greatest of all time. And then, of course, the last fight out was Stipe, and he's trying to write that in the trilogy fight. So, it's an interesting argument to make. I tend to think when you argue about the greatest in a division, you stick to what they've accomplished in that division. And so for that reason, as Cormier wins, it makes it a more difficult argument to make. But you can't take away what Cormier has established overall, throughout his entire legacy.
What does it also say about a guy like Stipe Miocic that this is a guy who he lost to Cormier, he avenged that loss. He lost to Junior Dos Santos, he avenged that loss. I always felt like somebody said for a guy who goes out and is willing to refight the guy that he lost to and get those wins back in the column.
I agree. It doesn't totally wipe it off your resume, but at least you say, hey, man, that's somebody that avenged that loss. George St. Pierre losing to Matt Serra, nobody ever even really bothers to talk about it because he beat himself thoroughly, in the rematch. So when you're talking about someone's greatness, if you're able to revisit it and you're able to be on the winning side, especially on the second time around, it shows your greatness and your ability to make those adjustments and to change things. And I think that is what lies here in this trilogy fight. Listen, there is an argument to be made that Stipe is the greatest UFC heavyweight of all time. Now, the interesting part about that is that, the number of defenses in a row. He has the most consecutive heavyweight title defenses in UFC history, but it's 3. So that's what to me is I don't want to say it's a dubious record, but it's one of those things where when you start talking about the runs of George St. Pierre, Anderson Silva, Demetrius Johnson, when you're getting up in the 10 consecutive title defenses and things like that, that's amazing. 3, it's just nobody's been able to hang on to this belt for very long. Unfortunately, the heavyweight division in the 4-ounce gloves, one wrong move and you're out. So it's tough. I don't want to take away from what he's accomplished, but it's just hard because it doesn't have that kind of lengthy reign. But what you said about Stipe is right. And if he wins this trilogy fight, it's a heck of a step in the right direction. And before he's always said, I don't care about legacy. I'm just here to support my family. That's all I care about. But lately he's kind of embraced it. Said, no, you know what? I do want to prove myself as one of the all-time greats. And I think that's kind of exciting to see.
What about also the fact that Cormier, it's well known that this is going to be his last fight. And this was his quote-unquote last fight for a while now. And Miocic, who's, 4 years younger than Cormier, one could argue that it's actually in the best interest of the UFC long-term if Stipe walks out of there with the belt, because then he's going to keep fighting. Whereas with Cormier, if he wins the fight, he's basically might as well just hand it right back.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially, long-term. In the short term, Dana White has said, listen, I don't think this is going to be Cormier's last fight. And I think by saying that, he's saying, look, if Cormier does win, we back up the Brinks truck and maybe we try to make Cormier Jon Jones again, but we do it at heavyweight this time. And I think that would be a huge, huge fight in terms of public interest. But, for Cormier, I don't know. That's a guy that he's had trouble beating. I don't know that doing it at heavyweight would make it any different. So, overall, I think it'd be nice for the UFC. But you look at Stipe, and to this point, he hasn't been the most marketable guy. He just doesn't really enjoy doing media. He doesn't, give lengthy, thoughtful answers. He's very, very quick in his responses, and he's just kind of not been the most marketable guy in terms of, the way Daniel Cormier is, who's just this eloquent speaker, jovial guy, enjoys it. And so I think, they would like to maybe, promote another Cormier fight. But if Stipe, again, could kind of embrace this idea of legacy and embrace this idea of marketing, and if he could win here, this would be huge for him, and maybe he could start to turn that sentiment a little bit.
John Morgan joining us here on the Boardwalk Kind of Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Make sure to follow him on Twitter at MMA Junkie John for all of your UFC and MMA coverage. UFC 252 tonight, the trilogy, Cormier versus Stipe. Now, you mentioned Jon Jones. Could the next fight for Miocic, if he beats Cormier, be against Jon Jones? Because we know that whole situation with Jon. Is he staying at light heavyweight? Is he moving up? Or what is he doing? And I feel like at least, physically, body-wise, Miocic, he's not one of these hulking, huge heavyweights. So I think that maybe physically that could work.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Listen, Jon Jones has teased the move up to heavyweight for a long time. We thought when he was a young guy that it was just going to be inevitable, that eventually his frame would get too big and he'd kind of grow out of it and he'd be forced to move up. But at 33 years old, that doesn't seem to be the case. He says it's easy for him to make 205. So for him to move up to heavyweight, he said it would take a little bit of a lifestyle change. He'd like to pack on some muscle. He wouldn't want to do it as just a one-off. It wouldn't get the type of public interest that another fight with Cormier would. Those guys just absolutely hate each other. And when they get together, man, it sparks interest. But I think it would get interest nonetheless. The greatest of all time in a lot of people's eyes, including my own, moving up a division, to fight the bigger, badder guy, maybe that would get public interest and would be a big, kind of payday for both guys. I could see it potentially happening, especially because, Jon Jones has already teased maybe a move. He's mentioned some other names at heavyweight. He talked about fighting Francis Ngannou, who isn't a title holder, but is, scariest dude on the planet. He's talked about it. He doesn't seem interested in the folks that are out there at light heavyweight. So I think there is a potential for it.
Heavyweight is kind of a weird situation right now because there's not like a definitive next guy after the Miocic Cormier situation. So give the audience a little idea of like what exactly are the UFC's options, because we saw Derek Lewis win, but he's kind of a strange situation. Ngannou's a popular name, but him and Miocic have already fought. Junior Dos Santos, he's just kind of hanging around, and so is Overeem. So what really is the state of the heavyweight division?
It's interesting, and I think, it's almost tough to speculate until we see what happens tonight because, again, Dana White keeps hanging on to this thing that Daniel Cormier is not done yet. He says, look, if he wins, I know there's more fights for him. If he loses, I know he's not going to want to go out like that. Now, Cormier has not cracked. He said, look, this is it. I'm done. And Cormier has set himself up well, right? He's got a great gig as a commentator. He's much beloved in that role. He's financially, he's done well for himself. He's invested in some businesses and stuff outside that seem to be doing well. So he doesn't need to fight again. But it seems that Dana White wants to keep him around. If for whatever reason, win or lose, Cormier is out after this, it's kind of funny. I'd probably put Stipe Miocic right back into another title fight. And I'd do it against Francis Ngannou. I mean, Francis Ngannou is a dangerous guy, and he's somebody that has worked his way back after, kind of a bad outing in earlier opportunities. He's made his way back, and I think he's scary. He's marketable. He's fun to watch fight, and I think he's probably at the top of the division. And then you got guys like Curtis Blades, who's there. Curtis Blades certainly a relevant contender as well, but he's lost to Ngannou a couple times. I think to me, the title fight that's next is Ngannou and Stipe, regardless. As weird as that sounds, whether win or lose, I think Stipe would have the right to go right back in there. So I think it's Ngannou and Stipe. If DC does win and he does stick around, if they can talk him into it, I think the only thing that would be interesting to him would be Jon Jones, and that would be a massive, massive money fight.
Now, we do have Junior Dos Santos, the former heavyweight champion, fighting on the card tonight on UFC 252. I know he's lost 2 in a row, but if somehow he comes out of this with a win, where does that leave him? Because, I mean, these heavyweights, it just feels like I always assumed that guys like Overeem and Dos Santos would might have been on their way out by now, but it feels like they're still hanging around and they're still viable.
Boy, how many times have we written Overeem off over the years? You're right, he's still around there headlining shows. And Junior Dos Santos the same way, right? 36 years old. But, man, in the heavyweight division, when you got those heavy hands, it seems like you can stick around a little bit longer. So, there are some names out there. This moment for Junior Dos Santos is a big one. He's fighting Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Jairzinho Rozenstruik lost last time out. He got absolutely steamrolled by Francis Ngannou in 20 seconds back in May. But do not overlook this man. He's a former kickboxer. He has an extensive kickboxing record. He's made the move to MMA, and he has got one-punch knockout power. I mean, he's absolutely devastating. Talk about Overeem. He had a pretty bad fight, if we're being honest, against Alistair Overeem. And then in the final 5 seconds of the fight, just lands one massive shot, game over. I mean, that's the type of power he has. Before that, Andre Arlovski in 29 seconds. I mean, a former champ, future Hall of Famer, knocked him out in under a minute. So this is a dangerous fight for Junior Dos Santos. He's a slight underdog in the fight. I actually lean towards Junior Dos Santos in this fight. I do feel that he is the much more polished striker. I do feel like he's much more mobile, again, much more refined in his approach. I think he's got, wrinkles to his game outside of his boxing that Jairzinho just doesn't have. So I lean towards Junior Dos Santos and the veteran savvy in this, and that would keep him up, in the very top of the rankings. But he has got to be careful. If he gets hit clean by Jairzinho, like anybody else, he's going to sleep.
John, also on the card, another fight that intrigues me is the fight for John Dodson. This is a guy who's been a contender for championship belts, and ever since he was a contender, he's had a pretty up and down career. Where is he right now in his career? Because he's not an old guy in terms of age, but in terms of MMA years, he's starting to get up there.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, it's interesting. We talked about in the heavyweight division, when you got those heavy hands, you kind of last a little bit longer. I think in the lighter weight classes where speed and reaction and all those things is really what it takes to be successful, those things do start to erode a little bit. Now, he's only lost to the absolute top guys in the division, Peter Yan, who went on to be champion, Jimmy Rivera, long-term New Jersey staple, who's just tough as nails and has fought with the best, Marlon Moraes, guys like that. I mean, you're absolute top of the food chain kind of guys. But I'll tell you what, he's training with he's fighting with Merab Dvalishvili this time around, I should say. And this is a tough test. Another guy that trains up there in the Jersey area, and just is an absolute monster, man. His wrestling game is on another planet. I mean, he's set records for number of takedowns. He started out with a couple of losses, but all of them really weird. Odd judges' decision, odd referees' decision, and now he's on a run. Listen, this could be a very, very long night for John Dodson. I hate to count him out because he's a world-class competitor. But I think, unfortunately, he's kind of facing the next generation guy right now.
UFC 252 tonight. Of course, John Morgan joining us here on the Boardwalk kind of hotline. Follow John on Twitter for all your UFC and MMA coverage at MMA Junkie John. Speaking of New Jersey, if we could just jump from this card to the next one. Obviously, a big guy in this area is Frankie Edgar. He's fighting Pedro Munoz on the next UFC card. Where is Frankie Edgar's career? Because I feel like this guy has had so many different renaissance and different variations of his life and his story, and the whole winning the championship and then dropping weight. Where is his career right now?
Man, Frankie Edgar is an absolute legend of the sport, right? I mean, if you like MMA, there's no way you don't like Frankie Edgar. Just what he's represented, his character, who he is as a fighter, who he is as a person. I mean, an absolute legend of the sport. But I think he's kind of approaching the tail end of his fighting career as well, man. He's only 38 years old at this point. And again, we just talked about in the lighter weight classes. It's not easy to compete that late in your career. And man, it just seems that the roster just keeps getting stacked with stud after stud after stud. And Frankie Edgar only fights the best. Because of his accomplishments, because of his pedigree, he doesn't get matched up with the up-and-comers. He doesn't get matched up with somebody that's not proven. He gets matched up with top contenders every single time out. And this is no difference. Pedro Munoz has had some losses. It's not like he's infallible, but he's got knockout power. He's got great grappling abilities as well. He's a little bit younger, and he's rightfully the favorite according to the odds makers. So I never count Frankie Edgar out. The guy is capable of fantastic things on any given night. But I do think, and I think he's admitted as much. He realizes it's coming to an end. But he wants to keep doing it as long as he can. This will be a big, big test. I mean, if he can get past Pedro Munoz, then you start talking about him, potentially fighting for a bantamweight championship at some point. But it's going to be tough. There's just no easy road for Frankie Edgar. But the man's a legend.
John, before I let you go, you've been covering all these UFC events for the last few months, from the beginning of the pandemic to now. Have you noticed anything that has evolved, anything that's been consistent? What has been some overarching storyline for you? Because as we're seeing in other sports, there are little changes, there are little variations that maybe people didn't see happening. So has there been a little change or some sort of pattern that you've noticed since these fighters are fighting in these bubbles?
Yeah, well, listen, first of all, kudos to the UFC for creating the bubble, in Florida and in Abu Dhabi, here in Vegas as well. I think the bubble is absolutely necessary. And I think other sports, especially as more sports, collegiate sports, NFL, continue to try to get up and running. You have to realize how important it is to create this bubble environment. But as far as performing within it, yeah, it's been interesting, especially the way coaching is being done. It's so quiet without fans. That guys can get, opponents can hear their opposing corners very, very easily in between rounds, giving advice, those sort of things. You have to be very, very careful in the way you do that. We've had fighters that are actually admitted that they're listening to the announcers because they can hear the broadcasters. And the broadcasters, many of them are seasoned, accomplished fighters, and they're giving great advice and they're making adjustments on the fly. So it's interesting, you don't have that added hype of the crowd to really make sure that you're on point, that you're focused. So it's easy, I think, to get off to a slow start. You got to find a way to get yourself motivated and get yourself on edge without that roar of the crowd providing that extra adrenaline. So, yeah, definitely some fine-tuning and approach and adjustments to the fight. It's been fun to watch.
He's John Morgan. Follow him on Twitter, MMA Junkie. John, of course, UFC 252 is tonight, and he's been covering the UFC scene all throughout the entire run during this pandemic. So make sure you check out him and the ongoing blogs, each and every UFC fight card over at MMA Junkie. And it's all guests. He appeared today on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. John, appreciate the time and enjoy the fights tonight.
Thank you, brother. Always a pleasure.